Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Welcome everybody to today's session on the Buddha's advice on how to succeed at learning and exams. Welcome to all those that are participating today who are young, old, and in between. Particularly a warm welcome to all the young people with us today. The slides that I've got will focus on the younger participants. However, the words of the Buddha will be useful to everyone, and let's rejoice that we've gathered here to do something really kusala, really wholesome on the first Poya of the year. So let's begin. So I'll give an outline, as I usually do, about what we're going to cover today. We'll begin with a few tips for the session. So these are the things that I always consider are helpful before we start the session, just to know what our intentions are and our attitude towards learning and hearing the Buddha's words. Then I'll give an overview, particularly about what our problem statement is in terms of the Buddha's teachings. And then I'll go into what are the hindrances, as in what is a hindrance, then also why it's important that we're looking at it, and the 5 hindrances, what they specifically are. And really we're looking at why we struggle and how we can actually succeed once we know what is actually blocking us. And so I guess what we really will come to is what's the key to actually helping us out in terms of the learning process and the studying process and finally the exam process. And it's applicable both to everyday learning and, of course, the learning on the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. So we'll cover that as well. Then I'll look at importance and benefits. So in this section, we'll be looking at what is it good to know before we get into the details of the 5 hindrances. You know, what is important to know about these 5 hindrances? And then what are the benefits when they're subdued and overcome? So we'll be looking at that. Then we have a reading from the Maha-Asapura Sutta. It'll be an excerpt specifically on what the Buddha says about the 5 hindrances. And it's also applicable to this particular teaching, and it's available in the Digha Nikaya in a number of sections as well, and probably other sections of the Sutta Pitaka. But the one that we'll read from is the Maha-Asapura Sutta in Majjhima Nikaya number 39. And then lastly, we'll take a deep dive into each of the 5 hindrances and spend a little time talking about what makes them arise, what makes them not arise, and then also how we can prevent them, like what is the Buddha's medicine for that, as well as some of the other practical things we can do. And then we'll meditate on each of them as well, so we get an idea about how to do a meditation in terms of subduing the 5 hindrances. So that's the outline for today. The tips for this session begin with taking the opportunity to enjoy hearing the Buddha's words. I think this one is pretty key, that we don't often get the chance to hear Buddha's words in everyday life unless we open up a sutta or we hear a Dhamma talk or something like that. But in everyday life, we don't often have the opportunity. And today is Poya, so it's a really good chance for us to really take delight in hearing the Buddha's actual words. And so in this session today, I've got quite a few different suttas that will support what we're looking at in terms of learning and studying and sitting for exams. So the encouragement is really to take delight, to really heed the Buddha's words. So that's the first thing. The second is, keeping an open mind as you listen and learn and meditate. And this is really about suvita, which is being easy to instruct, willing to listen, and willing to follow the Buddha's advice. As we know from the Anumana Sutta, in order to understand the Buddha's words, in order to practice them, it's really good to have these qualities of suvita. So keep that in mind, be open, and take in what you can. Then the third one is remembering that we all have experienced the 5 hindrances. So this is a really good one in the sense that when you hear about these obstructions to learning and studying, it's a really good idea to come from the basis that, we've actually experienced them before. And what you'll notice is as we describe them and go through them and meditate on them, you'll see that they're very familiar, that they're like old friends, but this time we'll learn how to overcome them, because really this is what troubles us when we come to studying, come to sit down to try and study, and also to cognize and actually understand things that we're being taught. So if you come from the basis that you've experienced it before, it makes it so much easier. The fourth one is thinking of your own examples and being honest. And that kind of flows on from that third one, that as you listen, certain examples in your mind might come up, like in the past in particular, where you actually resonate with what Buddha is saying in terms of, or how we're explaining the Buddha simile. And so when you listen and an example of your own comes to mind, use that in the meditation and use it to open up and see how you can actually resolve it, how it arose, and how to prevent it in the future. And so being very honest about that is really helpful. I've always said that Buddhist Path is very much about being honest with yourself. And so this is probably the easiest way that we can learn, is when we're honest with ourselves, when we actually come up with our own instances of where, certain unwholesome things happen. It's not to beat ourselves up, but to actually use it to actually overcome and then make progress on the path. Then we have being okay with not understanding everything. This is really good advice, because often we unconsciously think we need to know everything, that we need to absorb everything. If we don't get it, then we feel bad about it. And I think when it comes to most things, it's not possible to understand everything that you hear, particularly if it's a long session. So, and the other thing to say is that maybe one of the hindrances or some of the hindrances are actually obstructing. So that's another thing to bear in mind. So what I would recommend is being okay with, picking up and understanding just a few things, that maybe that is only what you need to understand for today, and that is perfectly fine. So don't be worried if, there's certain Pali words or there's certain things that are a little bit over your head. That's okay. In time, once you listen to these things again, it might become clearer. And maybe right now, you definitely only need one or two things. So be okay with that. And if there are questions that you have during the Q&A, please feel free to ask them. Or even offline, ask your parents or your grandparents or somebody that knows. You ask them the question, and either way, they'll follow up for you. So that's a good approach in terms of how to have this attitude during the session. Now, it's not easy to find the time to come to these sessions or even to want to meditate, even though the times are a little bit challenging at the moment in the world. But this last one is about having kindness and good wishes for everyone joining today. I think it's about offering a soft cushion to our fellow practitioners, to, all the children, all the young people, all the adults and older people that are with us today. And it's really nice to actually send out some kind thoughts and have some metta, some loving kindness to everyone. And that if they're meditating and they're around you, like they're at home with you today, and you see they're having a good meditation, or that you see that they're really enjoying this session, then be happy for them. I think, having mudita and supporting each other on this path is a really, really important thing. So I think that is the last tip for the day. And so I think this will be very helpful to all of us. In this section, we'll be looking at what is our problem statement, as in, why do we struggle to actually learn and study and therefore sit exams? And as part of that, I'll also give a bird's eye view, looking at Buddha's teachings in terms of the fundamentals, particularly around right view. And so this is what this section will be about. This is really our problem statement for today, as in, why is it so hard sometimes to learn and study and sit exams? And as you can see from some of the little pictures that is on this slide, you can see, sometimes we're just worrying about what we're studying. We're a little bit confused. Sometimes, we're overcome with drowsiness. Other times we're distracted and we want to, do something else, whether it's social media or other sorts of things. And then other times, we feel like we're running out of time, we're stressed. Other times we go towards, indulgences like snacking and maybe going and watching a little TV or just wanting to not study in many ways. And so this is what we're going to look at today, that why is it actually so hard to learn, and what are the things that we need to know in order to overcome them? And pretty much it's the Buddha's advice on the five hindrances, which are really the things that are active when we want to go and do something else other than learning, studying, and working towards studying for exams. It's really good to look at how the Buddha's teaching applies to what we're going to be looking at today. So the Buddha has some really good advice when it comes to studying and the process of learning and the process of actually sitting exams. So when we talk about everyday learning, then this is applicable to going to school and studying all the things that are there for us to learn, and then also to sit exams or tests. And the same goes for when you go for higher learning, when you go to university or college. And the same thing happens when maybe you're learning technical skills, maybe trade skills. And later on, it also applies to when you're working, that when you get a job, sometimes you have to learn something for your job, or you have to join some kind of professional association or membership. And at that point, there's also things that need to be studied and passed in terms of tests and exams in order to get a certificate. And then you find that there's everyday learning around hobbies and also sports and other kinds of things. And that also means that one, although it might be physical, there's also mental learning that's involved. And there may be tests or competition that people need to do, particularly in sport, that where learning is really, really important. And the test in that case is actually the competition itself. So Buddha's advice actually is very helpful for everyday learning. But Buddha's advice is also very helpful when it comes to Dhamma, when it comes to lifelong learning. Buddha's teaching is very applicable because we find ourselves, all of us, in this predicament where we're born and, all of us are subject to old age. That means we're aging. All subject to sickness. That means from time to time we get ill. And also we die. Now this applies to, people, animals, insects, all beings that we have around us. And so Buddha's teaching is very much about understanding that. And so the learning that you see your parents and your grandparents doing in terms of Buddha Dhamma is very much around understanding that and learning about the Buddha's advice on what's important, what to prioritize when it comes to this lifelong learning. And when you think about the exam, well, the biggest exam, the most important exam of our lives is really the one that comes at the point of death, that after we've lived our life, what happens next? Do we go to a good destination or do we go to a bad destination? And Buddha's teaching is actually to help us to go to a good destination. And ultimately, if we are that way inclined to go to no destination, but to actually achieve full awakening and nibbana. Now, where that comes in is that Buddha's teaching dispensation, his approach, has two distinct things when it comes to right view. So in this chart on the right, it talks about the Noble Eightfold Path, and it begins with right view. And Buddha's right view is about mundane right view and supramundane right view. So mundane right view is about cultivating a good life, a good wholesome life that enables you to be reborn in a good place, a place where there is safety from a lot of suffering. Doesn't mean there's no suffering even in a good destination, but it's just you're a bit more protected. And so Buddha gives you almost like a study program, particularly for lay people, householders, people like us who want to make sure that we end up in a safe place after we, finish this life. And then the supramundane path is really for people that actually see the predicament in a different way, in a deeper way. And it could be lay people, but it's also very much monastics, people that ordain into becoming monks or nuns. There are also lay people who also walk in the supramundane path. And this path is saying that they don't want to be reborn over and over again. And what they do want is to achieve what the Buddha and the noble arahants have achieved, which is full enlightenment or nibbana, full awakening, and to get out of the massive suffering that comes with simply being born. So what's really important about the Buddhist path is that he teaches this Noble Eightfold Path, and it always begins with right view. In the suttas, in all his teachings, he always says that right view is the leader. And so everything else flows from there. So if you begin with right view, then you have the right intention, you have the right speech, you have the right action, you have the right livelihood, then you make the right effort. And then after that, right mindfulness comes, that you remember the right kind of conduct. And therefore, after that, right concentration, that the mind develops in such a way along the right path. So the reason I'm raising this before we begin looking at the Buddha's advice specifically on studying is that when you get these things right, that means it becomes easier to actually study and learn. If you begin with the wrong view, then you'll have the wrong intention and then all the different kinds of wrong conduct through body, speech, and mind. And therefore, you can't develop the mind properly. You won't remember and you won't actually practice well and easily. So that's really the point that I'm trying to make, is that before we begin, it's really good to actually have the right view. And it's something that I will keep reminding us and keep encouraging us during this session as we go through the different hindrances that are blocking us towards our studying efforts and having a negative effect maybe when it comes to the time of exams. And the other thing to say is that sometimes, you expect, we're just going to talk about right mindfulness and right concentration, because what we need to do when we study is to be mindful and to remember and then to be able to concentrate on our studies. And although that is partially true, what's really important, and the point I'm trying to make, is that if we don't start with right view, then we may find that down the track we don't actually have the strongest foundation for mindfulness and concentration, that actually the kind of mindfulness and concentration we have is actually a little bit flawed, or maybe it's the wrong kind of mindfulness, the wrong kind of concentration. And that will become a lot more apparent when we get into the detail in the next few slides and on from that. And so I really encourage that before you actually address the Buddha's teaching in anything, whether it's studying or learning or any other types of meditation, that you always ask yourself, am I beginning with right view? Is this about non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion? Because if it is, then it goes a long way to subduing things like these 5 hindrances, because this path will be supported by good conduct. And it will also be supported by dana and bhavana. So, when you think dana, sila, bhavana, dana is, being generous and, giving what you have. And sila is about this moral virtue, which is all this good conduct through body, speech, and mind, and the precepts that we take that support that. And bhavana is this development of the mind, that we sit and meditate in order to develop the mind, to make the mind more malleable, more flexible, to lighten the mind, because it can't absorb things when it's heavy and dense and upset in any way, if it's suffering. And it's also about seeing the truth of how things really are. This makes it a lot easier to actually learn things, that when you're really honest with yourself, then the mind has this way of shrinking in terms of maybe the heaviness that it has. and then it opens up to actually truth. I think that's something that people misapprehend, that when they study, they think that they need to keep making the mind more dense by packing it in with things. But really, the process gets a lot easier when you lighten the mind first, and then what you do is you put in the good stuff that you really want in there. And the encouragement, even outside of the education learning process at school and at work, is always to use the Buddha's lifelong learning tips, lifelong learning techniques, and fundamentally, the Dhamma, the truth, in order to make the way easier. That if you follow the Buddha's path, it does genuinely make all other kinds of learning much, much easier. And I hope that we'll see that during this session. If we take the Buddha as our perfect teacher, then we know that Buddha had so many good qualities. He was a very, very amazing teacher, very, very amazing human being in the sense of having achieved the perfect enlightenment all on his own, that he figured it out all on his own. And he had such impeccable conduct. I think that is something to really hold in your mind, that Buddha's conduct was impeccable. Wherever he went, his speech was very good, his actions were very good, even the way his body language, everything. When you think about the meditation on Buddhanussati, like all the good qualities of the Buddha, you actually recognize how impeccable he was. And so when you actually know this, you know that the tips and the shortcuts in many ways, and some of the little things that he's telling us in his teachings throughout the suttas and the discourses and his sayings, that he's able to give us advice that saves us time, that helps us to study more wisely, that prevents us from being challenged on our learning process, whether it's the process that we're studying at school or at work, or this lifelong learning on the Dhamma path towards our ultimate test. And he gives us very precise information about certain obstacles, particularly mental obstacles, that we really need to listen to absorb, and then to apply. And when we apply it, it's good to see, is this really true? Does it work? And when it works, we say sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. We say thank you, because these things are really important and shared so generously by the Buddha. And it is really up to us again, and it's a reminder for us to be suvacha, to actually be quite open to the Buddha's teaching, to be willing to listen to his words, and then to be able to try and understand what he means, and then also to actually apply it, to actually practice it. There's no point listening to it and then putting it back onto the shelf. It's really important that we practice it. So hopefully today we'll get a chance to do all of the above, and we'll be able to take the opportunity on this Poya to do something very, very wholesome, as well as helping each other.